Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, in the last video, we saw how the government can influence the AD curve. In this video, we're going to be looking at the long-run aggregate supply curve and how the government can influence that. So, there are 4 policies the government can use to influence the long-run aggregate supply curve, and we look at how they can shift it outwards. The first is improving labour flexibility. So, the government can improve labour flexibility by either reducing the national minimum wage, weakening trade unions, and reducing benefits. So these are very controversial labour policies, but they all have the effect of improving labour flexibility. The first, reducing national minimum wage. Well, this will reduce the cost for firms, so they can hire more people in their firm for the same cost. Weakening trade unions. Well, this means that their employers will be asking for less wage rises and working for less hours. So it means that the labour market is more flexible. The final one is reducing benefits. So by reducing benefits, it encourages people to go out and work because the opportunity cost to sitting at home and doing nothing is higher, and they struggle to live off that a lower benefit. So they need to get off their asses and work. This is again another controversial policy because a lot of people rely on benefits for when they're out of work and may struggle to survive. So currently we're seeing that Labour and Conservatives are looking to raise the national minimum wage, and what effect this has, if we look at this diagram, is it creates unemployment, and it's not voluntary unemployment. Is in involuntary unemployment. So people are being pushed out of the market at this higher wage price shown here. The second factor is improving labour quality. Improving the labour quality. So the government can do this by improving education, and they can do that by either investing more in teaching and maybe looking to attract foreign teachers, or they can do that by directly investing in schools infrastructure. The third policy is improving infrastructure. So a lot of businesses rely on roads and railway networks to transport their goods and services, and these are, well, in the case of roads, are provided free of charge in the UK. So improving the infrastructure will mean that vehicles can get from A to B more easily. So that's another way the government can influence the long-run aggregate supply. The final way is through subsidies. So the government can look to encourage certain areas of the industry by providing subsidies to firms. So for example, Tesla was receiving subsidies for producing electric vehicles, and this encourages the firm to produce more and more goods because they're getting paid by the government for doing it. So these are long-run aggregate supply curves, long-run aggregate supply policies that shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right and outwards, improving the growth potential of the economy. So as we can see on this diagram, the LRAS is shifting to the right, and full employment, the output of full employment is increasing. So I hope this gives you an idea of how the government can influence the long-run aggregate supply curve. It's also important to note that if we keep the AD curve fixed, as we can see at the full employment level, the policy of the supply policy reduces the level of inflation and increases output, which is exactly what the government wants. And so they're very good policies, but obviously the long-run nature is the main drawback. Thank you for listening.